All right, welcome to Chapter 5, Lecture 5 in the Kinesiology 158 Motor Learning and Control class. In this chapter, we're going to cover the learning of motor skills, so really getting into the depths of what this class is all about. Some good questions to ask to sort of set off your exploration into this topic. We're going to define learning, absolutely. Talk about the difference between performance and learning, and that's a big part of this lecture. Understanding that, yeah, performance doesn't necessarily equal learning, and so when we're trying to assess whether or not someone's learned something, we can't always rely on their performance when we do it. Talk about the effects of practice on learning, and that is a big piece of the puzzle for sure. And yeah, even get into the upper limits of how much can somebody learn. Uh, so let's kick it off. Sorry. Um, so yeah, the distinction between performance and learning. So performance is something that's observable, something that we can measure, right? So somebody shooting a free throw in basketball, if they make 9 out of 10, their performance was, yeah, you scored 90% out of your attempts for free throw shooting. That would be a performance score. Learning is not quite the same thing. So we infer learning from performance observations. If somebody does hit 9 out of 10 free throws, we can safely assume that they've learned how to shoot a free throw. But you can't really measure learning. That's sort of an internal nervous system kind of thing going on there that we don't have the capacity to really look at directly. So we use performance as our tool to make assumptions about learning. So, you know, there is this distinction between performance and learning, and there are some misunderstandings, and quite often the biggest one is performance as a reflection of learning. And I've already said it before, and I'll say it again, performance does not always reflect learning. So there's, you know, beginner's luck, right? That's a thing. People can do something really well even though they haven't learned how to do it yet. So um, the idea of performance in how we perform it is very much a temporary expression of ability. You can perform well at one point and not later. It's a temporary thing. Again, that beginner's luck idea. Yeah, temporarily you are actually really good. Why? We don't know because you haven't learned how to do this yet. We can measure learning later on and prove that you didn't learn it. But so the idea that performance is temporary and not a long-term or permanent thing is important to understand. And yeah, within the construct of performance and the variables that affect performance, yeah, things related to instruction. You know, how have you been instructed to perform a skill? The environment in which you're performing has a massive impact, and of course you. Do you have the ability to perform at all? Are you able to throw the basketball that far? Some people it's hard. That's a long distance away, that free throw line. So a good table in your text that separates the differences or identifies the differences between performance and learning. Um, you know, be familiar with this table. It's pretty straightforward stuff. So assessing learning, right? And one of the good things is you're going to do this in a lab, right? So assessing learning, the term ART, or the acronym ART, A-R-T, acquisition, retention, and transfer tests, are probably one of the more common types of tests and research designs utilized in the world of motor learning. It gives researchers and others an understanding of how certain types of practice ultimately affect someone's retention and ultimately the transfer of those skills into other contexts. So those relationships are really a big deal. We're going to define art from here on out. So let's talk about acquisition. So acquisition is the direct measurement of performance experiences. So pretty much practice. Acquisition and practice can almost be used synonymously. Um, Trials will include practice attempts. We often graph these attempts, especially in the context of research, not so much in the real world, right? But we do a lot of acquisition trials. You know, pick your favorite sport, and as you learn how to play that sport, you're constantly doing acquisition trials, right? I'm going to keep shooting free throws. Those are acquisition trials. I'm going to keep doing it. Do you graph your performance? Probably not. Some people might. Hey, out of my 10 tries, I do shoot 10 free throws every day, and I'm going to write down how many I get. You would think over time there'd be an improvement over the number, an increase in the number of free throws you make over time, as you continue to practice. So let's talk a little bit about these performance curves. And you're going to be doing an art lab, or maybe even two, during this summer session. So the performance curves are a way to visually represent performance during acquisition trials. Occasionally there can be this distortion of accuracy, and looking at the graphs on the right there, at least that very first one, the sort of jagged red, the jagged red lines kind of going up and down. Sometimes if acquisition trials aren't done long enough, an idea of performance can be distorted, right? And if you look at this red line right here, as an individual performs, and this is obviously arbitrary stuff, there's no labels or anything, but performance we can assume is improving, but then there is sort of these, the two-step forward, one-step back idea. And if we look at and interpret a graph too soon or without an adequate number of acquisition trials, the true nature of that performance curve may not be revealed. And then one other thing, what's quite often done, and you won't be asked to do this in your labs, I don't think, but a lot of times then when one acquires raw data, like would be in this red graph, then there's usually an attempt to smooth that data out to get a better understanding of the relationship between number of attempts and performance. So some general ideas, right, about these performance curves and their features, right? One is things to look at, right? The general direction of the graph. And so usually repeated performance, almost always, right, results in improved performance, right? And so is the graph moving in an upward direction or downward direction? Trials may become more consistent, so the variability between attempts may be very scattered, and then as the attempts get more frequent, then the variability, right, the consistency of the performance does also start to narrow. And so using that graph on the upper left there, right, those jagged lines over time, you would think the height of those sort of jagged, the sawtooth sort of pattern, at least the height of that would minimize, right? Someone would become more consistent in their efforts. One thing is important to note, right? Performance curves do not indicate learning. They do not say, okay, just because you're getting better at performing does not necessarily mean that you're learning anything. But at some point you have to assume. So types of performance curves. There's 4 different types. You should be familiar with these 4 types of performance curves. So looking at the top 2 curves going across from left to right, we have what are called linear performance curves. Right, pretty obvious stuff. Linear performance curves, and all these curves will have performance on the y-axis, and then trials or practice trials across on the x-axis. Linear performance curves basically say that, with each attempt, with each trial, the level of performance increases in a predictable linear fashion, right? So each trial of 10, you increase performance by 1, and that just continues. So you end up with a linear relationship. Depending on the type of skill being performed, the linear relationship, right? So both performance increases on the graph, so there's an upward slope of that line. On the graph on the right, that inverse relationship still has improved performance, but in this case it's an inverse relationship because performance scores decrease as performance improves instead of increases. So as an example, number of errors, right? So if you have a high number of errors with one trial, and as trials continue and performance continues, those number of errors get less, you would have that inverse linear relationship. So that is not an indication that performance is getting worse, so just make note of that. The bottom 2 curves are considered negatively or labeled negatively accelerating performance curves. And so when you look at them, right, the learning, which is a very dangerous term to use here by the authors, learning or performance is probably better to say. Performance occurs rapidly, so improvements in performance occur rapidly in the beginning, right? So we have a situation where, in the very beginning, your rate of improvement is very high per trial, but then as you continue to perform, that rate of improvement starts to decrease a little bit, right? And so think of some examples of skills or tasks that you would perform that where that might happen, right? And this happens in sport or any type of real life motor skill learning situation, right? At the beginning, it's like, oh yeah, this is easy, easy, and you're not very good, and so there's a lot of room to improve. But then as you get better, that rate of improvement starts to approach what's considered like a ceiling, right? So negative accelerating performance curves, lots of improvements in performance early on. They tend to decrease as trials continue because there's just not as much room to improve as you become more proficient. All right, the other two, or the last two types of performance curves, we have on the top of this slide the positively accelerating performance curve. So opposite of the negatively accelerating, right? So in the beginning, you see with this type of learning curve, the improvements are very small. It's in a situation where, yeah, the learner isn't quite getting it just yet, right? It's like, I can't get this, sometimes this happens with golf quite a bit. I just can't really get it. And then all of a sudden something clicks, right? That light goes on. It's like, oh, I think I got it now. And then there's this accelerated phase of improvement where it's like, wow, early on, I, took 20 hacks at the ball and only 5 of them even got off the tee. Whereas now every one is making it off the tee and going, farther and farther each shot, that kind of idea. So, the idea of the positive accelerating performance curve is a little bit unrealistic. It's hard to come up with a motor skill that would continue beyond a certain amount of time to accelerate in that sort of positive exponential kind of fashion, right? That would almost say at some point improvement is going to be with each trial incredibly high, right? You may never get to being vertical, but each trial the performance is going to keep improving. So at some point you'd have to assume things are going to become what's down the bottom of the slide is an S-shaped performance. And if you look at the S-shaped performance curve, it's kind of the combination of the positive accelerating performance curve followed by the negative accelerating. A little bit more realistic, right? The idea of the golf swing, right? It took a while for you to figure it out. So very slow increases in performance in the beginning, but then you have this middle phase where, oh yeah, now I'm getting the hang of it. But then all of a sudden you're getting to sort of oh man, I can't, I can't hit it more than 150 yards and I'm just not figuring it out. And so those very small improvements, right? Oh, I got it, 160 yards now. Yeah, little improvement, but compared to early on where you're improving, whatever, 30, 40 yards per stroke, a little bit less, or that negative accelerating sort of performance. So the S-shaped performance curve definitely is a more realistic idea compared to the positive accelerating one. That's for sure. All right, so comparing our 4 types of learning curves, surely there's been enough research out there to understand. This is, to me, that kind of Captain Obvious sort of stuff. What is the most commonly observed? Well, for typical motor skills, the negatively accelerating curve is most often observed, right? And so remember, that's one where, yeah, improvement is high early on, and then improvement sort of slows down a little bit as you continue to do your practice trials. For more difficult movement patterns, right? And I mentioned the golf swing earlier. That would be a good example. For more difficult movement patterns, the positively accelerating or the S-shaped performance curves are more common, meaning in pretty much that positive accelerating, like I said before, not so much a realistic thing, right? You're going to have that early phase where it takes a while to get the hang of it, yes, but there has to be sort of some sort of deceleration, right? That negative accelerating has to start happening at some point. And so that S-shaped performance curve is most common with the harder or more difficult skills. So there's something called the law of practice, and the law of practice basically talks about how do we utilize the information about learning and practice into sort of a real life way. And so the law of practice states that, yeah, pattern of improvement during practice can be predictable. And depending on the skill, and right, we should usually have an understanding of the skill itself. We usually have a situation where early practice, there's a rapid improvement. The continued practice improvement is slower. And researchers out there have come up with mathematical equations to predict, yeah, if you practice this skill for X number of time or X number of trials, your estimated or predicted level of improvement would be this, right? And over time, because we have an understanding of the type of performance curve associated with this type of skill, and we've done our research, we can use a law of practice as a kind of a nice tool to predict. Yeah, you participate in this class where we're going to put you through these practice trials and all that, and we can safely assume that at the end of this class, you're going to be at this level of proficiency. Clearly, there's factors that can influence those predictions, but generally speaking, if the law of practice holds true, which it does, those predictions tend to be quite useful. Some other things about practice and the nature of learning. There's this idea of the monotonic benefits assumption. And this is an interesting one, and it's been researched quite a bit. As practice continues, so does learning. It never stops. And some of you might be freaking out, going, "No, wait, I can, you can max out this potential of anything, right? You can get to a point where you just can't learn it any better." And we can spend hours discussing and coming up with specific skills where it's like, yeah, you're right, maybe this has a ceiling and you can't get better after that point. But there's been a fair amount of research into this, and there's a William Crossman study that's mentioned in the text. You should know this study. It's a cigar study, not on smoking cigars, but on rolling cigars. And it looked at cigar rollers, I believe in Cuba, but I'm not exactly sure. And it looked at cigar rollers over 30 or 40 years of their performance. And these workers, these individuals who rolled cigars for a living, were paid by the number of cigars that they rolled. So they kept close count of how many cigars were rolled. And clearly these individuals, these workers, had motivation to continue trying to get more efficient or better at rolling cigars. And what they found over, and I think the study was done for 30 or 40 years, is that even though, right, there's a very steep learning curve in the beginning, as you'd assume, but once workers got to a very high level, they still every year were able to eke out just a few more cigars. And so that learning curve really never hit that full-on flat sort of plateau, or what's called an asymptote, right? And so this asymptotic nature of learning, this upper limit of learning, never really quite reached. There's always a little bit of room for improvement. So understand the cigar study, understand this idea of the asymptotic nature of learning. We can never, it's good, right? It gives us the hope that, yeah, I can, even though I feel like I'm really good at this, I can still get a little bit better. Always room for improvement, right? So let's talk about retention, right? Our second part of art. Retention is a way to measure the persistence of original learning, or performance. So retention tests are basically taking your performance variable, but after those performance trials have been done. So we usually give some sort of interval. So let's do, let's take 20 golf swings, and let's measure, the accuracy or the distance, whatever you want to measure with that golf swing. Let's take a day off, right? And then let's just have you do a golf swing again, and let's see how well you've done, right? So we've graphed your improvement for the golf swing. You went from hitting it 30 yards to 100 yards. Congratulations. But now we're going to have you come back the next day after you've had some time off, and let's see how much of that learning, of that performance that you've retained. So retention trials are considered to be a measure of learning. Hey, you came back after your day of practicing golf. Now you took a golf shot and you hit it just as far as you were at the end of the day yesterday. You've retained that level of learning that you were demonstrating through performance the other day. And then finally, there's transfer tests. And transfer tests are similar to retention tests, except they're put in a different context of this performance of that skill. So transfer learning of skill from one condition or skill to another. And so let's just say, yeah, you were learning how to hit the golf ball off of a tee. Well, let's see now if you're improved. So a transfer test would be, well, let's just see if you're hitting it off the turf, right? And so you're not using a driver, you're maybe using some sort of iron or whatever it is. You're going to use probably a different golf club, but it's still a very similar skill, not the exact same one. So there's some argument in there, but you're measuring with the transfer test the ability to apply a skill that was learned in one context into another. And transfer tests are considered a measure of learning strength. And we can make some fair assumptions. Yeah, you got really good at hitting the ball off the tee, but you still are horrible at hitting, with an iron off the turf. So the transfer was very little between you learning how to hit it off the tee. That's quite often the case in a lot of contexts of sport. So back in 1979, not too far in the past, Shea and Morgan did an interesting study, and they wanted to see if the way we practice has an influence on retention and transfer. So if we practice in different ways, like same amount of volume of practice, but if we just organize a practice session a little bit differently, we spend a whole chapter talking about practice later on. But if we change up the way we practice, is retention and transfer going to be different, or is even acquisition going to be different? So what they did was came up with a very simple study. They had two groups. One did what was called blocked practice, and what they did was they had a set of different skills, and they performed each skill in succession. All right, I'm going to do skill 1 10 times, and I'm going to do skill 2 10 times, and skill 3 10 times. So in a blocked manner, right? The other group did what was called random practice. So they had the I think it was 4 different skills that they were practicing, but they weren't told which skill they were going to do. They were just then told, okay, on the fly, do skill 1, then 3, then 4, then 2, then 1, then 5, or 4, that kind of randomness, right? So block practice, they had the knowledge or understanding that I'm going to do this first pattern, because it is a pattern, we'll look at that in a second, do this first pattern 10 times in a row, then I'm going to do the second pattern 10 times in a row, whereas the random group had no idea what pattern or what skill they're going to be doing. They looked at acquisition, retention, and transfer from performing those tasks. Yeah, and this is a picture of the apparatus that they use. I believe we have one of these in the motor learning lab. You do not use them in this class. But the idea of this trial or this research was, or the use of this apparatus, you'll notice that there's lights on the back row there. There's a warning light that gave the subjects an idea of when to be ready to perform, and I believe it was a timed type of task. And then one of 3 lights would go on. With the block group, the red light would go on, which would indicate a certain pattern of knocking over or hitting these sort of targets on the left and the right side. The blue light would indicate a different pattern of hitting targets, and the green light would be a third pattern. The block group did the red, then the blue, then the green, whereas the random group was not told which color they would do. The warning light would go on, then a color, one of the 3 would show up. So think about it for a second before we get there. What do you think the results were? How do you think the acquisition trials went? Which group do you think had better performance as they acquired, right, as they practice these skills, right? 3 different skills, it's 3. So which do you think had better acquisition trials? Which do you think had better retention? And which do you think had better transfer? So we'll graph it, we'll look at it. So here is the results of this Shea and Morgan experiment. The green data with the squares is the random practice. The red data with the circles is the block practice. So if we start on the left side of this graph, you'll see the acquisition trial. They did blocks of trials. They did 6 different blocks, I believe. And then it's a negative, or it's an inverse curve. So basically, movement time was their measure. So how long did it take to perform the task? You'll notice that right off the bat, the blocked group way outperformed the random group early on in acquisition, right? It's pretty significant, right? Probably pretty half the time almost that it took the random group. So it was taking the random group it was slowing them down, having to think about what pattern they had to do on the fly, right? Versus the block group knew exactly what to expect. So as they, once the warning light went on, they knew exactly what to do beforehand. So as acquisition trials went on, what do you notice? Yeah, they pretty much equaled out, right? Maybe just a slight difference in time, but really probably within error, and probably not a significant difference in time at the end of those acquisition trial blocks. What's probably more important then to understand or look at is what happened with retention. So they did perform these trials. They're given some time off. I think it was only 10 minutes. Let's see how they would perform with their retention test. The retention test data, the arrows are somewhat confusing, but looking at the random practice group versus the random practice group outperformed the block group. I don't know if the results are significantly different, but at least visually, yeah, there's a separation. The random group did better with the retention test. More importantly, let's look at the transfer test. And the transfer test, I forget exactly. I think they were then presented with a new pattern to do. And so how well did the random practice group respond to a new pattern compared to the block group? Unbelievably different, right? So the random group, at least trying to assess learning, was random or blocked practice better for learning? Well, if you look at retention and transfer, really that random type of practice is best. Even though early on you're looking at performance, you're going, wow, this block practice is what's best. Maybe not in the long term, right? And so for those of you who are coaches or clinicians or whatever you're going into, think about that application, right? Do you take a team of brand new 6-year-old soccer players and have them do the exact same thing over and over and over again, and then have them do another exact same thing over and over again? Or do you challenge them with sort of situations where they're given a random type of set of skills to perform, even though it might look like, chaotic in the beginning, perhaps over time, their learning, their retention, right, might be improved depending on how you set that practice up. So interesting indications and implications, excuse me, of that type of data. All right, let's continue with this learning stuff. Overlearning. Overlearning is an interesting idea. We all do it with some things, for sure. Overlearning is this concept that continued practice beyond a desired sort of original learning level of mastery. So yeah, hey, I've gotten good at shooting free throws. Why should I keep practicing? I've retained it. It's a transfer there. Why do players like Steph Curry or LeBron James or whomever, right? Why do they still practice shooting free throws? They can't possibly get any better. They've done their overlearning, beyond overlearning, right? And so the goal with overlearning, and this is just continued practice after that level of mastery, is more not to necessarily get better, but to really not forget, right? And so, certain things, when we start talking about memory and long-term memory, players like Steph Curry and LeBron James probably won't forget how to shoot a free throw in the next several decades. But it is sort of more important to continue practicing beyond mastery, to stay fresh, right? To maintain that level of mastery is probably a better way to say it. Research on overlearning schedules has been done. How much should we practice beyond our mastery level? And so for simple skills, the idea is, 50% of original learning, of overlearning is good for simple skills, whereas 200% overlearning, which means, double what it took to get there originally, is good for the more complex skills. So the more complex the skill, the greater amount or the more overlearning is beneficial to maintaining that high level of performance. So it's some advantages of overlearning, right? So can we argue that, you should probably keep practicing even though you think you're good? There are some advantages. Over time, research has shown that the capacity to respond quickly, adapt readily to changing situations, and perform with very little conscious attention is improved. And that's a huge deal, and that's another sort of peek into a later chapter. But yeah, if you can all of a sudden perform without having to think about it, that allows you to divert or dedicate your attention to other things. And in the context of sport, especially, that's huge, right? If you're a soccer player and you're really good at dribbling, but you have to really just look at the ball and you can't look at anything else, that's not such a good situation. But if you get so good at dribbling from over practicing, over learning, that you don't even have to look at the ball anymore, and you can read the field and read your players and the defenders, now you're at that automatic phase where, your performance, even though your dribbling hasn't really improved, you're still just as good at dribbling, but your overall performance is better because you're able to dedicate your resources, your attention and whatnot to other things to allow you to perform better. So it's a pretty big deal. The disadvantage of overlearning, pretty obvious one, time, right? It takes a lot of time, right? Hey, I'm good at this. I can't spend an extra 2 or 3 hours a day learning how to dribble or whatever it is. So the time factor is a big deal. And in this day and age, in the context of sport especially, and at the youth level and college level, right? And some of you out there are probably college athletes. How much time do you have left over from college practice or club practice or whatever sports you play to overlearn? So that's a big one. Are there other disadvantages? There are. The time factor is a big deal, and that extra time and that extra practice, depending on the context of the skill or sport, things related to overtraining start to creep in, right? Is there going to be a decrease in physiological levels of performance because of overtraining? I'm spending an extra 2 or 3 hours in the gym every day, not allowing time to recover, and so not only is it chewing up time, but I'm not going to, I'm breaking my body down in the process. So that always is something in the background that creeps in. All right, so talking a little bit about more about the transfer of learning. So is there an influence of learning one skill on performance to another skill? What do you think, right? This is a huge deal in sport. Can I practice, and the example down below is, if I practice jumping, which is one skill, will there be transfer of that jumping to maybe my rebounding ability, right? If so, that is huge, right? Because now all of a sudden we think, okay, we can have you practice something in one context that we know is going to help you in another context. We can then maybe avoid things like I mentioned earlier, like overtraining. We can maximize practice efficiency. Depending on the skill, generally the idea of transfer of one skill of performance to another skill is relatively weak. There are ideas and strategies to do this. The idea of proactive and retroactive transfer design is out there, and so some people design training of learning of certain skills with these proactive and retroactive designs in mind. And so, so the first paradigm, which is the proactive, you perform an influencing task before practicing the actual task itself. So in my example earlier, right, the jumping for rebounding, yeah, you practice jumping, and then you see how that affects rebounding. A retroactive design is you practice rebounding, then you practice jumping and see how that affects rebounding afterwards. Looking at these types of designs sort of visually, there you go. For you visual learners out there, this helps. It helps me. I'm a very visual person. So, the proactive design is, yeah, learn task A, which is jumping, and then learn task B, which is rebounding. Did task A have a positive influencing on task B? Well, we won't know, so we have a control group that doesn't learn how to jump, but just goes and learns how to rebound. So proactive transfer design, yeah, we do it. We do it inadvertently, subconsciously, and especially in the context of sport. Right? Hey, if you're going to be rebounding, why don't we make sure that you know how to jump first? That's a kind of an essential component of rebounding. Pick your sport, pick your skill. You can come up with other examples, right? The retroactive design takes, again, that same task B, which in this case is rebounding, have both groups, in this case, learn task B. So your experimental group learns task B, control group learns task B, rebounding. But then have the experimental group be taught how to jump. And again, this is not necessarily the best example, but I think you get the idea. But don't have the controlled group learn how to jump, and then have them both come back and do rebounds and see which group does better. Do you think, right, that this type of design will help? Or is there a positive transfer or retention, a transfer from that type of practice? Depends. It always depends. So the amount of transfer between the motor skills is good when the skills are very similar. So using the jumping example, what do you think? Is jumping similar to rebounding? Yeah, right? I guess in that context, it probably has an effect. If you learn how to jump better, your ability to rebound is better. That's considered near transfer. So similar skills, there is this near transfer idea, and the more similar your skills are, the greater potential for transfer. Far transfer, dissimilar skills, not so much, right? So you, instead of practicing how to jump to rebound, you practice how to, I don't know, swing a baseball bat, right? Is that going to help you with your rebounding? Probably not. You're using a couple of the same muscle groups, probably, but not in the way that you're going to be using them for rebounding. That's a far transfer kind of idea. Best example I could come up with. So finally, going to finish this talk off between sort of learning in different types of practice situations. So we're going to talk about play and deliberate practice. So research has shown us, and time in general, that the most effective learning situations are highly structured, involve engagement in activities for the purpose of developing specific skills. This is referred to as deliberate practice. Deliberate practice is the best way to learn. It's effortful, it's closely monitored, it's directed towards goals, and then that last bullet there, it's motivated by a desire to improve. And so if you have a group of individuals that really want to get better at swinging a golf club, and you come up with a very closely monitored and sort of goal-oriented strategy, set of way to practice for them to get there, that is the best way to do it. Conversely, we have sort of the opposite situation with play. So play is intrinsically motivated. You do it because you want to do it. It has an enjoyable aspect to it. You do it because it's fun. It's non-literal. It's sort of an as if or pretend, like, yeah, whatever, pretend that you're going to be, swinging the golf club, or you're in a golf tournament or whatever it is, right? The idea is based on the means rather than the ends. So not so much, we don't care if you win. We just want to have fun doing it. So how, the actual process of doing it is what we care about most. We're not even going to keep score. How many strokes? It doesn't matter. And then also important with the idea of play as practice, there's flexibility. It's not focused. There isn't an outcome or even a schedule. Just let sort of things happen organically. There is a classification of activities that have been proposed by Coate and Hay, and they kind of look at the different characteristics of free play, and they've come up with some other categories: deliberate play, structured practice, and deliberate practice, to kind of compare them, right? In the real world, what do you want from your learners, right? Do you want, as a coach or as a clinician or as a trainer, where do you want to fall on that spectrum? I think the biggest factor, and it was on the bottom of this slide, if you have motivated individuals, deliberate practice is, by far, research shows it's the best way to learn. But if your group that you're working with or individual that you're working with is not motivated and they don't necessarily want to improve, deliberate practice can be a waste of time, right? And so then the idea of play becomes really important. Hey, you want your individuals to have fun doing things. They're still going to learn. It just won't be as quickly. So this Coate and Hay sort of classification here, we have, on the left column, we have orientation of activity, and then we have their sort of 4 categories going from free play all the way to deliberate practice. And for assessment purposes, you don't need to memorize this, but you definitely need to understand the difference between free play and deliberate practices, the disadvantages and advantages of each, and sort of the comparison and the contrasting of each, right? Where do you want to fall in certain contexts of, if you're a coach of 6-year-old soccer players, do you want to have, should it be a deliberate practice? Do you want them, in a structured situation where everything is goal focused and goal oriented, or do you want to have a little bit of a free play idea or approach or strategy to that practice? And what would be your argument for one or the other? And maybe even challenge yourselves, come up with different situations. If you are a clinician, if you're in a physical therapy type of situation, right, and you have somebody coming back from some sort of significant injury, what would your argument be for the type of practice you would want them to employ to reach their goals? Should it be free play or should it be deliberate practice? You put it in the coaching context or whatever you want. So again, you don't need to memorize this table, but you definitely need to know the difference between the sort of factors involved. So that's it for this lecture. I will see you next time.